The origins of Pax Americana, or in modern-day lingo, the American Empire, began with the Monroe Doctrine, which was announced by the 5th President of the United States and slave owner James Monroe back on December 2nd, 1823, as part of the State of the Union address. It was announced that the United States of America would protect its American neighbors from European intervention in those kingdoms of trying to reclaim their old colonies that successfully rebelled against their imperial overlords. The crowns of England, Spain, Germany, France, Portugal, Holland, Austria, and Scandinavia wanted their old colonies back after widespread rebellion occurred in the early 1800s, spurred on by the successful American Revolution. But at the time, the United States was unable to enforce the doctrine due to the size of their army and navy, but they continued to warn Europe to stay out of the Americas. The leader of the Latin American Revolution, Simon Bolivar, appreciated that the United States and President James Monroe had their backs. Despite the announcement of the Monroe Doctrine, Spain tried several times to reclaim the newly independent Mexico after they kicked the Spaniards out in 1821. The Spaniards used loyalist guerrillas and clandestine military operations until they were finally quit on September 11, 1829, when they were crushed by the Mexican defenders at the Battle of Tampico. But they didn't officially recognize Mexico until 1836. Great Britain violated the Monroe Doctrine a few years later in 1833 when they sent the HMS Clio along with a bunch of Royal Marines to reclaim the Falkland Islands from the independent country of Argentina. Europe continued to mess with Argentina when France and England, now on friendlier terms after the Napoleonic Wars that occurred a couple of decades earlier, violated the Monroe Doctrine again in 1838 when they blockaded the country on the guise of supporting the Peru-Bolivian Confederation. The European kingdoms were trying to assert their authority over the fractured governments. In 1842, President James K. Polk warned Great Britain to stay away from the Hawaiian Islands. They told the Crown that the islands were under the protection of the United States and the Monroe Doctrine. In reality, he wanted the islands as part of the United States and to exploit their raw resources as part of his vision of manifest destiny, an America which would stretch from coast to coast and beyond. Spain reclaimed its old colony, the Dominican Republic, in 1861 when its president, Pedro Santana, a royalist, gave up his country back to the Crown. The United States at the time was involved with its own civil war and was unable to issue a response or take over the island. The Civil War opened the door for other European kingdoms to fool around in the Americas. Several months later, the French Empire, led by Napoleon III, took advantage of the civil war in Mexico between the monarchists who wanted to bring back the Mexican Empire and the liberals, led by Benito Juarez, when he invaded the country on January of 1862. And after a few years of conflict, the monarchists and the French army were able to take Mexico City and name Austrian Duke Maximilian the second emperor of the Second Mexican Empire on April 10, 1864. The United States was unable to enforce the Monroe Doctrine due to being in the middle of the U.S. Civil War, but they kept the list of violators who were to be dealt with after the hostilities between the states ended. Great Britain created the British Honduras in an attempt to solidify a foothold in Central America and unified all of their colonies in the area under one large umbrella colony. Spain, led by Vice Admiral Jose Manuel Pareja, led an invasion of the Chincha Islands in 1865. The small islands off the coast of Peru were rich with natural fertilizer created by the seabirds and were coveted by the Crown. After the Civil War ended, Secretary of State under President Lincoln and later Andrew Johnson, William Seward was finally able to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. At first, he warned the French Empire and its leader Napoleon III to leave Mexico. The U.S. government even sent an army regiment to the U.S.-Mexican border to encourage the French army to leave the country. The French army eventually left, and the Second Mexican Empire collapsed without their support, as the monarchists were defeated by the liberal rebels. Maximilian I, the second and last emperor of Mexico, met his fate little over a year later. President Ulysses S. Grant tried to annex the Dominican Republic in 1869 in an attempt to prevent Spain from trying to retake the eastern half of the island. This was part of the Reconstruction phase after the end of the U.S. Civil War. Eventually, he wanted to make it a state in the Union and a place for former slaves to live in. The measure failed in the Senate. The Monroe Doctrine was enforced once again in 1895 when Great Britain and Venezuela got into a conflict over its borders. The two nations were arguing over the Guianas, which brought the administration of President Grover Cleveland into the brouhaha. The United States forced the two nations to settle their differences with an arbitrator. Great Britain came out as the big winner when they were given over 80% of the disputed territory. In the same year, Cuba rebelled against the Spanish Empire in a war for independence, which would last until 1898. The conflict would drag the United States into the fray when the USS Maine, which was in Cuba to support the rebels, was blown up either by the Spanish army, an accident, or an agent provocateur, most likely an accident due to the coal being stored next to the ship's munitions. The Spanish-American War made the United States enforcing the Monroe Doctrine from protector to oppressor. With the promise of freedom for the newly freed Spanish colonies, they soon became to be ruled under the thumb of the United States government when they were made into territories and exploited for the raw resources. The policies that began under President McKinley when he started the Spanish-American War would soon be expanded by his successor, Theodore Roosevelt. President Roosevelt made an addendum to the Monroe Doctrine in 1904 when he announced during the State of the Union address that the United States would intervene in the internal affairs of any Latin American country guilty of chronic wrongdoing or an impotence which results in a general loosening of the ties of civilized society. He called it the Roosevelt Corollary, which was part of his Big Stick ideology. Roosevelt's Big Stick ideology was to use his military to enforce the government's diplomacy by possessing a serious military capability that would force the adversary to pay close attention. At the time, that meant a world-class navy. The other qualities were to act justly towards other countries, never to bluff, to strike only when prepared to strike hard, and to be willing to allow the adversary to save face in defeat. But mainly he used it in Central and South America to bully his neighbors. The Monroe Doctrine, which was meant to keep Europe out of the Americas, laid the groundwork for an American empire. The Illustrious Narrator would like to thank you for watching the first episode of Pax Americana. This new series will talk about the rise of the American empire and the factors that led this great nation from being the beacon of independence and liberty to that of a nation-building oppressor. The Monroe Doctrine was one of the steps that led to this. In future episodes, we'll be talking about manifest destiny, the meddling around the globe in corporate interest, the creations of filibusters, the Monroe Doctrine, and other similar topics. If you enjoy this video, please subscribe and tell a friend.